We have Ken Meter, who is also one of our keynote speakers. He'll be presenting on Sunday about his 40 years working in Alaska's food systems. He is one of the most experienced food system analysts in the U.S., integrating market analysis, business development, systems thinking, and social concerns. He holds 47 years of experience in inner city and rural community capacity building. His local economic analysis have promoted local food networks in 140 regions, in 40 states, 2 provinces, and 3 tribal nations. And I guarantee each and every one of you has probably quoted him in a grant application or a report at some point. So, and if you haven't, you should have, says Amy Pettit. So this is Building Community Food Webs, which is based on a recent book he wrote. We have copies, and he will be signing them at the Mix and Mingle if you're really nice. So, Ken Meter.
It is great to be back in Anchorage and seeing all the Alaska folks again. You folks have been really welcoming for a long time. I'm going to tell the 41-year history on Sunday, but today I'm here to talk about my book. Amy, I think I really have heard 6 references to our study in 2014 just in the last 2 days, and that's really unusual. Most states don't remember the work we do. So thank you for keeping that alive and for using it. That really makes me feel very good. What I want to do today is talk about a book I just wrote, and it was my effort to kind of summarize some of the best fruits of the work I've done around the country. I've been really lucky, and I'll say more about just how lucky, but I've been really lucky to get around quite a bit and see a lot of the cool projects that are happening around. And I think what's relevant for you folks in Alaska the most is, first of all, there's a whole chapter about Hawaii and the work that they did. You heard about the hui this morning. Some of the background for how that got formed is written in one chapter of the book. And their effort to really use traditional culture as a way of framing an alternative to the plantation system that has now collapsed. And that's a very rich story right on its own, and you'll be working more with Hawaii in this Regional Food Business Center process, so that may be helpful. Otherwise, I'll be going through the examples, but I think what's interesting is, for those of you who have time in a winter night when it's 60 below zero outside, you can really get a sense of what other people have done to build networks. I'm seeing a lot of good networking here happening today, and the different groups that are working together. It's really inspiring to see that happen here. A lot of states I work in cannot pull that off. And I think that the sort of small informal conversations we often have about, well, I can do this and I can do this and I can be flexible and we can kind of make something happen together, that's really the heart of this work in my experience. And the book is my effort to try to tell that story a bit. So my first slide is a picture of Kurt and Corrine Bench outside of Toledo, Ohio. I like to tell their story. This slide is about 10 years old already too, but Kurt had a full-time job with Archer Daniels Midland, a major grain trading company globally. And he lives in Toledo, but he lived on a farm very close to where his grandfather had raised the best sweet corn in the Toledo market. And after establishing himself with his career, he decided that he wanted to grow his grandfather's corn. So he worked full-time at Archer Daniels Midland so he could hire 21 people part-time to manage his farm, enough that he could build 400 CSA members, and then he felt that he could leave his job and start farming full-time. And I think his story is, in my mind, is emblematic of what all of us are. We sort of have one foot in this world that might be paying our bills, and another foot in the world that's expressing the vision of where we're trying to go, and we're trying to balance those things in very precarious ways all the time. Kurt was lucky because he had coworkers at ADM who said, "You're doing the right thing, keep at it." And they were very happy to work with him at ADM, but also say, "Go get free." And I think that there's a lot of us are doing the same dance, and it's, this is all long-term work. It's very difficult. The obstacles are huge. We don't have the support we need. We're getting a lot more support now than we've ever had. But I think Kurt and Corrine kind of exemplify how we all straddle those worlds. This map shows the places I've been able to work. This is about 5 years old, actually, but the brown areas are states that I've studied, including Alaska, of course, including Hawaii, and several other states around the country. And the green areas show smaller regions where I've done an economic study or a regional food system plan or something like that. I've tried to carve out the terrain of, we have a lot of great initiatives to support a certain kind of farm or a certain farmer or a certain chef or a certain industry. I think the really tough work, ironically, is to get rural regions to feed themselves and to think about this as a coordinated strategy where we really do planning over the long haul to make that a long-term, resilient, regenerative thing. And that's really tough work, mostly because everything is stacked against us and we don't have a lot of political presence right now, but it's also really the heart of what makes us go forward. So I've been really privileged to have this education of getting out to so many places to learn firsthand from people like you what's going on and how to convey it. Here's a copy of the picture of the front cover of the book, and as Robbie said, we've got copies here for sale, and I'm happy to sign if you'd like. What I tried to do with the book, as I said, is kind of summarize some of the key insights that have propelled this work forward in my own personal experience. It's not the definitive version of this because we all have our unique stories. This is the stories that I know the best and can tell the best because I've had the relationships with people who told me what they did. But I am also the only one I know who's tried to really document how the commodity system we've inherited has really systematically drained wealth out of rural areas of the United States. And so I go into great depth in that book about how is the food system we have sucking wealth away and making it hard for us to make the changes and move forward in the way we want to move. And I think it's really kind of precious data that no one else really has. I'll show a little bit of it later. The book also tries to document community initiatives, especially 8 especially promising networks where people really laid down their individual turf and their political disagreements and just sort of said, let's work together to make something really creative and exciting happen. And I think people tell me that's really fun to read and also I think inspires some new thinking from place to place. Also tried to write it in a popular voice. I was really pleased when a radio commentator I know who used to be an English teacher declared it a page turner. And for an economics book, that's pretty good. So I hope you enjoy reading it and I'd love to hear back from you if you have a chance to do that. I'd like to also step back. I think I probably said this when I spoke in Anchorage and Juneau and Fairbanks and so on in 2014, but I like to always focus on what's the purpose of a food system. We've heard some very eloquent descriptions of that already today, and I just want to offer my simplified version of that. Often our discussions about food systems boil down only to economics, and I like to think about economics. I like to do economic data. But that's not the only answer. It really has to be, food systems have to be building health, wealth, connection, and capacity in our communities. And if we focus only on the economics, only on the money, we lose. But also, if farmers are not making money over the long haul, if food businesses are not making money, it's not going to be resilient or a sustainable system. So I just like to say that to remind us that this is complex work and we have to go multiple directions at once. It's not simply about profitability at all. Another rant I have is that we hear a lot of language about supply chains, and I'm having a little bit of a fight about that because I use this diagram all the time actually to kind of show how food moves from a producer through different channels and ends up being aggregated and purchased by wholesalers and getting to individual customers. This is actually a very good format for calculating value when you say how much value to each step of this process add to the product that the farmer raised. However, it's really a misleading image of how the food system works, and I prefer a term that I call I prefer to first of all put that in a circle where you start at the top and you have farmers who produce foods and that goes through the same characters, but it ends up producing waste, organic waste that can be recycled into new fertility and create new resources for farmers. So you're really building a circular system rather than a linear system. And circular systems are not chains. You don't have one person in the chain wagging the chain and telling other people what to do. But more than that, especially as we localize our food, we have connections in these blue lines across these systems. So a group of farmers might own a processing plant together. Or we might have people investing in stock in a local bank so they can make investments for local food businesses to flourish. And what I really like to remind ourselves is that this is really more a web than a chain. And if we don't think about building strong webs, we often build chains that are exploitive. And of course, chains also resonates with slavery and the whole kind of history of oppression we are coping with in this country a lot. Okay, let me just go through the profiles of a really quick review of the 8 profiles in the book. Montana farms formed communities of co-learners. You heard that phrase earlier this morning, of people learning together during the last farm credit crisis, the 1980s. Conditions very similar to what we're facing today, where people really were stuck and didn't know what to do. And they came together to really come up with very creative things that launched new global industries as well as new sustainable production and new community food webs. Next, I go to Hawaii, as I mentioned, that's reclaiming traditional cultural values in an effort to really show how to make a better food system that moves away from the plantation exploitation. A food bank in Tucson that really hands out food as a first step in a conversation towards engaging lower income people, lower wealth people in how do we change a food system so it works better for us. So it's really a matter of creating spaces for empowerment and for activism and for really community building rather than simply handing out food and stopping at that. Next, economic developers in 11 counties in Northeast Indiana who decided to work together as 11 counties to do economic development so they would not be fighting each other over siting a new factory. And they came together to form the Northeast Indiana Local Food Network and asked me to do some economic studies and some SWOT analysis and some strategic planning about how to take the next steps forward in that network. Next it goes to Athens, Ohio, where a group called AceNet has been really created one of the top 2 food processing centers that I know of in the US at kind of community scale, along with Ronan, Montana, which is featured in chapter 2. And that's also a story of people moving into a town of Athens and having a model and then learning that the low-income people they worked with didn't like the model, so they changed the model to be more responsive to where people were and what they really wanted to have happen, and then created a whole new set of wonderful possibilities. That's also a very nice story. Go to go to Phoenix, Arizona next, where a lot of the farmland is owned by housing developers who are getting a tax break because they lease it to farmers to farm, but farmers are literally farming for a year at a time on hundreds of acres and knowing that they might be kicked off the next year. And the contention between development and agriculture in a suburb of Phoenix is really quite profound, and that's a very interesting chapter there. Then we go to Colorado, suburbs of Denver, where local officials came together and decided that the way to respond to that development pressure was to actually buy farmland at its development value and hold it for permanent use in agriculture. An incredible story of people working for government who took in phenomenal risks to just make things possible for really not just kind of protecting farms, but rebranding the entire community around being a farm community instead of being just another bedroom suburb of Denver. And then finally, Minnesota County that has over 35 years or so very patiently constructed networks of green space so wildlife could transit between 2 river valleys without getting interrupted by highways or blocked by housing developments or commercial developments, but really making sure there was green space available. That commitment became an effort to try to clean up the water quality in the Minnesota and Mississippi River, both very challenged water systems. And that led to negotiating with developers that developers could build a little bit more density if they would maintain green space in their development, keeping this whole network of green space alive. Again, kind of a lot of good compromising over 35 years with some mixed results, but a really interesting story of people thinking outside the box. Okay, that's the quick review of the book. I'm going to come back to each of those stories a little bit more depth later on, but let me start with the financial data because that's really the heart of a lot of what's driven my work all over the country and some of the work you folks have seen in Alaska. I like to look at the net cash farm income for all the farmers in the U.S. in one batch. And of course, Alaska farms don't show up as more than a blip in this chart, but it's a very, their farmers here are definitely affected by the same economic forces. If you look at the last 100 years of farmers producing food in this country, you see dramatic growth. The orange line shows how much farmers have sold since, I think it goes back to 1910 or so, 1918. The orange line shows tremendous growth in sales. Unfortunately, the maroon line shows tremendous growth in expenses of farming. So as the more and more farmers sell, the more and more it costs them to produce their food. So the red line shows the net farm income for all farmers in the U.S. That's the expenses subtracted from the cash receipts for selling their product. You notice that those are remarkably stable over time. They haven't, for all the growth in sales, we're not getting more profit, we're not getting a lot of wealth built in rural communities. But of course, this is only one way of looking at the data because inflation has really challenged the value of the dollar in this time. We've probably lost about 16 or 17-fold the value of a US dollar over the time of this chart. So I like to adjust this for inflation. There's the same chart adjusted for inflation. With the orange line's a little bit hard to see in this room, but you basically see that things peaked about 1973 or so, and then they eroded pretty quickly, and they peaked again about 2009. So we've had these uneven growth, a few peaks that didn't last, and then collapsed down to something else. And then the maroon line, which is easier to see, shows that as the prices collapse, as the markets collapse, production expenses have to go down because farmers can't spend as much. And what you see now is that actually the net farm income, the red line, has been diminishing steadily for over 100 years. And it also has some peaks at very specific points in time. I'm not going to go into depth on that because you can read about that in the book. But they're all basically crises in which we had a global crisis that U.S. was able to supply grain mostly to foreign countries because of a war or because of post-war growth, or the energy crisis of 1973. And during those crisis periods, farmers made a lot of money. But as soon as the crisis was done, things went back to normal and the net income eroded away. And unfortunately, this is kind of the pattern that we get with any commodity system. So when you have a thing that, when you make food into a commodity, that's likely to be the result. Ironically, this is the increase of productivity farmers have enjoyed since that time. This is actually since 1948, the only data I have. But farmers have more than doubled productivity since World War II, and yet the net income has decreased. So even becoming more productive as farmers was not rewarding financially. And I think we often don't stop to take that step to think through, well, is being productive going to serve me more than the banker? Is it going to serve our community more than other people in the economy? Those are questions that are very hard to raise, and I've somehow made a living raising those questions all over the US. I find the question of farm debt to be a very potent lens for looking at the farm economy. And this shows the cumulative difference between what farmers have paid off in interest on debt that they paid to lenders and the money that they received from farm subsidies. These are all negative numbers because for the life of this chart going back to 1910, basically farmers have spent more paying interest on loans than they've gotten from federal supports. Now, there were no federal supports before 1933, so that's not a surprise. But what you see is kind of basically a net flow of money away from farm sector, leveling off between 1933 and 1973, where the New Deal farm programs kicked in. They were written by white farmers with land, and they worked pretty well for white farmers with land. But they stabilized the farm sector in a way that these payments balanced out. You can almost imagine the folks in Washington smoking cigars and saying, we have to give farmers enough money that they can keep paying off their loans to bankers. And that was stable for 40 years. But then in the OPEC energy crisis of 1973, that all went away. And overall, I can track $600 billion leaving the farm sector nationally because of interest payments. They exceed the value of farm subsidies coming in. There's also a lot of money farmers have spent buying inputs that were sourced far away, things like fertilizer and seed, which in many cases, fertility and seed were produced within the community back in the old days, and now they're increasingly something you have to buy in the commodity market. And so I can track about $3.2 billion leaving the farm sector in purchasing those items, which at some point could be purchased inside the community, but no longer can be. And I don't have good data about all the farm machinery farmers have purchased or technical advice. I don't really have money on seeds or livestock. So there's bigger losses that really we don't have good data for. But if you add the $600 billion and the $3.2 billion, you get about, it's $3.2 trillion. You get $4 trillion leaving the farm sector, which is what I promised that I had documented. And to give you some sense of how important that is, the whole value of all the farms in the United States today is $3 trillion. And that does not count the farms who lost their income because they went out of business. So you have this flow of money that's bigger than the entire farm sector we now enjoy. And we're not talking about how that extraction has really plagued rural America. We're not talking about how to reverse that in any more than fairly small circles like these. The other factor of this, and this is less true for Alaska than other parts of the US, but this chart shows how much food farm families reserve for their own use from their farming. Where in 1950, about $20 billion of food was reserved by farm families for their own use. That has now gone down to almost zero. So we have a country that says we feed the world, where farmers do not even feed themselves. And the sector as a whole has decided to go to the store and get fancy food rather than really having the means of surviving itself in rural community. It's a really remarkable transition. I'm going to stop with that just because I think I want to go on to some other material here. But the other thing I just want to point out is that I'm going back to the same chart I showed you before, but it turns out that the medical costs of diabetes and related medical expenses in the United States as of, I think about 2015 or so, was $327 billion. That's 88% of the value of all the products all the farmers in the US sold in the most recent year of this chart. So essentially, when I buy a bushel of grain from a farmer, I'm giving a dollar. For every dollar I spend on the farmer, I'm giving $1 to the medical system to treat me for the cost of our diets. And that's not a system that's going to sustain health over the long time. We just know that's not going to work. So, I mean, and the work you folks are doing is the best work I can think of for really trying to reverse these relationships. But I also think it's important for us to kind of know this in our heads so that we can understand what we're up against and understand how to be strategic with it. The other little fact I'm going to throw on the table here is that the United States is very proud of feeding the world, and I first got to Alaska to look at the Delta Barley Project and the effort to export barley from Alaska, from a state that's importing 90% of its purchased food. And even while we claimed to be feeding the world, we were food stamp recipients went from $7 billion to $64 billion. So we have increasing hunger while farmers are going more broke, and healthcare costs are going up, and we're calling that a sustainable. We're calling that our food system. That's really why all the things you do with so many obstacles and so many ups and downs are really important to keep going. We certainly need commodities, but also the commodity system we've inherited is very toxic to rural communities. I think when I started talking about that in the farm crisis in the 1980s, people just totally ignored me. Now I'm having trouble keeping up with the language of people understanding the extractive economy. And I think that's now become sort of second nature to talk about in rural America. And the investments the federal government's now making in rural America are one effort to try to replace some of those dollars. Okay, let me dive into the case, the specific stories in the book a little bit more. Montana, as I mentioned, farmers and ranchers felt stuck in the mid 80s because of the farm credit crisis, and they looked at their bottom line and said, we can't keep farming this way. We're burning up our soil, we're not making money, and our markets are gone. And they turned to the farm organizations who said, we don't know what to do. So they went to an alternate energy organization called AERO, A-E-R-O, Alternate Energy Resources Organization, and they said, you should support us because we are harnessing renewable energy from the sun on a daily basis. You should work with us. A very clever way to spin that argument. And AERO said, you're right, but we don't know anything about agriculture, so we don't know how to help. After a considerable conversation, the group sat down together and they realized that what AERO could do was to have some small experiments that would happen around rural Montana. They gave out grants of $200, $600. This is the 80s when this money went a lot further than it would go today. But they basically said, they challenged farmers, said if you can get 3 or more farmers together with one person who's a researcher or extension agent or somebody who can kind of help handle data in a robust way, we'll give you a small grant. And the only thing you owe us will be a report on what you learned by doing that. And that led to creation of more than 200 clubs like that across the state of Montana, engaging 600 people across the state. They convene people in statewide meetings like this so people could sit down at tables and say, this is what we learned in our community, what did you learn in your community? And that created a statewide conversation about how do we feed up Montanans with Montana-produced food. And the book tells some really great examples of, I think the most commodity example would be interesting is that a lentil industry in the Dakotas and Montana really came out of that because people who are using legumes for building soil fertility realized they needed a better market if they were going to be able to rotate those into their crop rotation. So they developed essentially an export-based lentil and dry bean economy that had not been there before because of experiments like this on a very small scale on 1 or 2 farms at a time, and then thinking creatively about how to extend what they learned. Building on that foundation, a small food processing center in Ronan, Montana, a town of 2,000 people organized, Mission Mountain Food Enterprise Center. And they've become one of the national leaders in my book of doing community-based processing to help local food businesses form. They came up with a very interesting product called Montana Marinara that's being shopped around quite a bit, where they're taking USDA commodity tomatoes that come in big cans, and they're opening up those cans and putting Montana-raised squash and onions and garlic and a couple of spices in there, and they repackage it for schools, and they've got 152 schools across Montana buying this product that they can manufacture because they have a small town food processing center in a town of 2,000 people. But that kind of creative thinking happens with a lot of grant money, a lot of stepping back and just working together to kind of think, well, how do we use this resource of USDA tomatoes that nobody really, we have plenty of them and they don't taste that good, but they're helpful. So how do we make something that tastes much better and has better nutritional value that also adds some value to Montana farmers? So some really creative kind of ways of just going outside the box and making good new stuff happen. I'm going to count on my Hawaiian friends to correct me on this if need be, but I did a study for the Hawaii called Hawaii Food for All, I think just after a couple of years after the one I did for Alaska. And what we learned was while we were doing the research for that study, the entire plantation industry in Hawaii collapsed. And that was only about 120 years. As Saleh mentioned earlier today, Hawaiian Islands used to be self-sufficient for food. They were using hand tools, but they had community-level systems, village-level systems that protected water, protected air, protected people's health. People had 4 or 5 hours a day of free time, and they were using very simple tools, but everybody was eating well. And they made sure that everybody had access to food. And that system was blown out of the water by the plantation system. That system had been in place for thousands of years, or had been developed over thousands of years. And 120 years later, after the plantation system steps in, it collapses itself because it was based on outside markets and based on people buying from far away who had no commitment to Hawaii. And it was based on large-scale systems that could not be sustained from the resources Hawaii could muster. So it's a really wonderful, again, inspiring example of traditional ways, indigenous ways being stronger and more resilient over time than some of the kind of Western notions we cooked up. It also created incredible disparities that would not have been allowed in traditional society. Traditional society had people whose job it was to make sure everybody had food and would make sure everybody had a chance to participate in labor to make sure the harvest came in and the village watershed duties got done. And these inequalities would have not existed under the traditional system, but they became really stark under the plantation system. This is a fish pond that people on some islands, this is the island of Kauai, where people have reclaimed old fish ponds that the traditional people used to, they would encourage some fish to go into a pond and let them reproduce there, and they'd have fish that they could very easily harvest without going into risky water. And those fish ponds are coming back in select places. I think Molokai and Kauai are the first places I know about trying to bring those back. And in some way, a symbolic effort to kind of show what can be done, but also a very important potential food source too. The result of our study was to show that at that time, and this has now changed with all the work that Saleh and Harmony and others have done in the islands, but at the time we did the study, we found out the best way to get farm income to farmers in Hawaii was to make sure that everybody who deserved SNAP coupons got the money and spent that money on food from farms in Hawaii. And that was the biggest single step that could be taken the most easily to get income to farmers. A lot of things have happened to make that story different now, but that was also a tremendously creative and important first step to take. And again, a way of thinking outside the box of commodity markets by saying, how do we get food to the people who most need it? And how do we then use that process to build a bigger awareness of food across the islands? This is the chart that we drew upon where the green line are the SNAP coupons that are coming in. The red line is the net farm income for all the farms in Hawaii, declining very readily. It had been negative for 7 or 8 years at the time we did our study. And really a lot more money was already coming in from SNAP coupons than from selling farm products. And then you look at the tremendous changes that Saleh and his colleagues have done with the hui in Hawaii to really turn that around. Next to Tucson, Arizona, where a food bank has really taken a much more creative stance. This is a organic farm inside the city of Tucson, and I come from a place that has pretty deep topsoil, pretty black soil, and I look at this and I say, you can farm that organically, and I get kind of blown away in a dry climate. But yes, they can, and yeah, they do. But I think the bigger message here is not just that it's a farm, but it's a training farm for people who live in a low-income community. And one of the people who got trained how to farm there ran into opposition from the local park board and decided to run for park board and became a park commissioner. And so the process of actually raising food inside a low wealth community led to leaders surfacing and taking matters into their own hands and changing the policy regime. A very different notion of food banking than typically we've had in the past. And as I said before, food donations become the first step in cultivating empowering relationships, not the final reason for being engaged with each other. We have a good story about a woman who took her family's tortilla recipe and modified it because her son was having intolerance issues for some of the grains, and so she modified the recipe to make a tortilla that her son could eat, and that became a very popular tortilla brand. So again, a lower income person whose son had health problems, she responded to that by starting a business that made a living for several people in the family. And the food bank helped them with technical expertise to start that business and to find people who could help them with branding, financing, and publicity. Actually, they got a lot of publicity from local media because the food bank had connections to help make that story more public. Another wonderful story in the book is about a guy who was a school counselor who realized there was a plot of bare land inside the school that was not being used, and he decided to start a little garden there. And he found that by inviting kids to work the garden with him, he was having better counseling experiences than he had been trained in counseling at school, because by working together, the kids would just have a different conversation. They let their guard down, and they were having more fun talking, and they developed a closer relationship gardening than they would do if they were kind of professional and client. And that led to their parents getting involved in helping save the school when the school was almost shut down by the school board. And again, a whole ripples of community impact that happened because people started gardening inside a small vacant lot inside a school building. And then I mentioned before someone who ran for municipal office. Sorry to jump around so much, but you can read the book if you want to dive in more. Northeast Indiana is very interesting because it's a red state, and I think it's, I really enjoyed working in this area because we were kind of able to push some people's expectations by doing this. So, some very conservative wealth and for some very, I would say, visionary people for conservatives trying to make some good things happen in their area. This is a map showing the region that they worked in. And the economic developers, as I mentioned before, had decided not to compete with each other for factories. But they also had an analysis that they had some very good farms in their area and they had some very good food manufacturers. So they sat down with the farmers and they sat down with the manufacturers and said, let's figure out a system where you manufacturers can buy food from local farms and we'll make a product that builds more value for our own region. Well, the manufacturers, after 2 years of talking, said, we're competing with each other. We don't want to collaborate. And our markets are in New York, in Boston. We're not really interested in serving markets in Indiana. So when that collapsed, the developers had the wisdom to hire a consultant from Chicago, who had the wisdom to hire me, to look at, so what do we do to form a network of people who really want to feed each other instead of kind of thinking about exporting somewhere else. And our strategy was fairly simple. We said, rather than saying, this is what you should do, we said, let's map out the networks that people have already built trying to respond to that question. And so we were able to go to people and say, here's a network that's forming already. Why don't you support that work? Rather than saying, you should do something different. And that was a much more powerful way to have that conversation. So Blaine Hitzfield is one of the brothers of Seven Sons Farm, and that farm story is wonderful in itself. But I sat down with him, and I asked him, would he give me a list of the addresses of the people that he sells his food to? And he said, sure. And in 30 seconds, he developed a spreadsheet showing all the people that they sell to. And this is a little hard to see in these slides, but this is near Fort Wayne, Indiana. And those lines show that they were selling a lot of food, direct delivery. This is basically frozen beef and pork and eggs. They were raw eggs. And they were selling them to Chicago and Detroit and Indianapolis customers who had money for high value products. They built a pretty robust business. They were wonderful doing it. They're very great farmers. But also, when the developers looked at this map, they realized we're not penetrating the Fort Wayne market very effectively at all. What do we do to make that different? That's been a very tough question for them to address. But I think what I liked about this was the power of mapping something like this. In 30 seconds, they got that right away. They understood the strengths of what was happening. The developers had not considered this farm part of economic development before, and now they realized there was actually a very interesting, robust industry that they should pay attention to. And they also said, and we've got to think about Fort Wayne as well. We've got to think about the folks in Fort Wayne who don't have the money, and why can't people in Fort Wayne get the same quality food as Chicago and Detroit folks? So very rich lessons out of a simple map. It took a couple hours to put it all together. And I credit the developers for really reaching out and saying, we have got to pay more attention to low-income populations. We have to consider that part of our job as economic developers. That's where the development really needs to happen in our region, and we're going to apply more attention. They started sponsoring those efforts and thinking about their own role in that in a much more robust way. I wouldn't want to say they're perfect about that, but they're really trying. I mentioned Southeast Ohio, the AceNet group. What I liked about this was kind of young folks with a lot of idealism and some long hair moved into Athens, Ohio in the 70s, and they had been in West Virginia and Virginia, and they kind of said, you know, people just aren't ready to change here. We want to go somewhere where the people are open to something new happening. And they hunted around, and they found Athens, Ohio, a university town, and they said, we feel like we're being welcomed here. We want to settle here. And they decided they wanted to start worker-owned cooperatives as a way of getting low-income people out of poverty and managing their own businesses. And they started doing that, and actually two of the businesses they started, one's a Mexican restaurant that's a wonderful restaurant, it's a worker-owned cooperative, and another bakery are still doing business today, last I checked in. So they had some success, but what didn't happen was the low-income people they intended to serve said, we don't really want to be owning a business. We don't have resources. We can't handle that financial risk. That's not how we think about ourselves. We want jobs. We don't want to be owning. And so they basically redirected their whole approach and said, okay, let's not do worker cooperatives anymore. Let's do what people want to do. And they, over a couple of years of conversation, realized that they could help a few individuals, like a woman who had a salsa recipe that came from her family, and she knew how to make it, and it was really tasty, but she needed a place to make it. She needed expertise in branding and marketing and financing and all that stuff. So they said, we'll surround people like that with the expertise and the label making equipment and the processing equipment so they can take that dream and make it a real product. I'm getting ahead of my slides here. This process required a lot of grants from anti-poverty efforts. It was not something that financed itself at all. And they kind of raised money in the name of low-income people and then helped low-income people start some businesses. They also found that the most likely people who were going to use their processing plant were the restaurateurs and chefs in town who needed a place to make tomato sauce when the tomatoes were coming in. And it became more of a professional function for some of the people with means in the community, but it also was a path to a few individuals to start local food for businesses. And I start that chapter talking about the Kroger store in that town had a shelf about 30 feet long featuring all Ohio-made products. And that happened because the Kroger store manager said, I want to work with AceNet, and AceNet said, we'll work with you to populate this shelf with Ohio products. And it was the only store in Kroger's that did that. But it happened because the owner stepped out of his boundaries, out of his comfort zone, and there were resource people locally who could help make that happen. Next, to Maricopa County, Arizona, or the Phoenix metropolitan area, and mapping was pretty important here. We found that there were incredible markets for food in Phoenix, $12 billion of food being purchased every year. I think we had 1.9 billion being purchased in the whole state of Alaska, but this is one county that buys $12 billion worth of food. But they have very fertile soil. They have incredibly good growing conditions. They have long established large farms raising produce, and they're importing most of their food. And this is a farm, it's an organic farm that was doing something like $50,000 per acre of sales. The farmer told me I could sell $50,000 if I could find enough people to buy it. He had a very efficient farm. He was doing really well. His workers really liked him. Well, he was operating on land that was owned by a developer, and they kicked him out about 2 years after I was there because they wanted to start building housing on land. And so the whole issue of how do we make these farms be more permanent rose pretty quickly. We also worked with a private food distributor, Stern Produce, that had worked really hard to develop an Arizona-grown branding program, and the woman who ran that program had gone out to visit 10 farms and really brought people into a conversation about how do we work together as farmers to deliver fresh produce from Phoenix farms to Phoenix consumers. And ironically, that fell apart because the firm had some management troubles, but also bought software to make that more efficient, which ended up making it really difficult for people to talk to each other. So the whole effort floundered, and the woman who'd been coordinating that went to work for somewhere else. And that was an example of a private distributor really trying to do the right thing, but then kind of running into a dead end of her own. This is a farmer, Eric Schmidt, who had a 2 or 3 acre farm, and he was selling up to $320,000 of food per acre on this farm on a land that he knew he was going to lose in a year and a half. But he set it all up with portable hoop houses and portable trailers, and he knew that he could pick up everything and move it to a new site when that day came. But he had incredible production capacity, and local officials were just not helping this process happen at all. This picture kind of encapsulates the development pressure that farmland is facing in an area that has a very hot suburban market. Well, again, in this case, we did mapping of social networks. And this is, again, a case where mapping really told a story very quickly. So we interviewed a bunch of the food system practitioners, and these maroon dots are the farmers we interviewed. We asked them to identify the 5 people they felt closest to. And you'll see each line here represents one farmer saying that farmer is one of the people I'm closest to. And you'll see there are 2 clusters that kind of revolve around 2 separate farms, but those farms are not talking to each other. And you kind of feel like the farmers are lonely, which is exactly what the farmers told us when we interviewed them. So one guy said, my main source of information is the internet. And they weren't turning to the farm organizations. They weren't convening with other farmers to figure that out. Now, we also interviewed some people who were in city staff. We interviewed nonprofits that worked with farm food issues, we studied farm organizations. Once you get all that together, you get a whole elaborate network of people who do have some connections with each other, and that becomes much more possible to get good stories and good collaborations formed out of that network. And that's what I mean by community food web. We showed these maps, and I showed a little bit more rigorous version of this to the Food Summit in Phoenix, Arizona, about 2018, I believe. And again, 30 seconds, city officials got it. And I was sitting down for dinner after my speech, and a city official ran up to me and said, your map showed me that we've got to do better. And they started sitting down with farmers and saying, we want you to come in and talk to city government, city staff. They formed a CSA for city staff so the farmers could deliver product right to the city offices, and the city staff could pick them up there and take it home. And very seamless, simple thing. But it expressed a bigger effort of saying, we want to know our farmers, we want to have a communication with them on what they need, and we want to form a connection over time. And again, by mapping that lack of connection farmers felt, city officials figured it out in a way that they'd never figured out before. So I think that felt like a very good intervention on our end. Okay, only a couple more stories, and then we'll have some more time for discussion. But Brighton, Colorado, Adams County, Colorado, suburb of Denver, not too far from the Denver airport. One of the leaders of this effort was the owner of the Berry Patch, which is a CSA farm, a U-pick farm, and a farm stand on this beautiful old barn in this suburb. And he got together with a foreman of a work crew for a very large-scale vegetable grower. And they said, all around us are these really ugly collections of suburban buildings that all look the same. It looks very weary. It looks, and we all moved out here because it was a farm community, and we want to keep that quality of farming alive. And they started a conversation with the city and the county and said, can we somehow protect agriculture? The idea came forward that the city and the county might be able to buy some farmland. Well, guess who opposed that the most? It was the children and grandchildren of former farmers who said, I want to sell this land to the developer at the highest value. I don't want to have it be protected for agriculture. And so you had this big fight break out in the community where the people who owned the land, who had the farming heritage, did not want to protect their own farms. Because they were landowners now. They were people who didn't have an investment in farming in the community. And we had very contentious meetings, but again, the big conflict between development and farmland. And some huge, thousands of acres of beautiful cabbage and potato and onion fields, shipping food all the way to the East Coast, but not to local consumers. And there were big contentious meetings. The result of that, however, after a lot of agony, was that the city decided that they could form a vision for the this action plan, a landscape design firm called Logan Simpson put this plan together. He identified the parcels that had the best access to water and the most fertile land, and said, let's save those as a priority. There's about 1,500 acres in that priority category. And after doing that, as soon as they declared that as a priority, one of the fiercest opponents of this thing said, I'll sell my land to the city then, because I'm going to get paid the development value, which in this area was $60,000 an acre. It was $30,000 an acre for land and $30,000 an acre for water rights. But people, as long as people could get their money, they were not going to fight it anymore. And that created also someone else stepping forward and saying, I'll put my land in a conservation easement so we can make this real. The city then got together and rebranded the entire community, called Historic Splendid Valley, thinking more about white settlement than other history, but still saying we all want to be an agricultural community. We want people to come here to celebrate open space, quiet, and food that we grow, and going to restaurants. There's a bike path nearby, so bicyclists can come in and take that step. 1,500 acres are projected to be protected. They know they have to surround that with supportive services. It's not just going to be protecting land. But again, really courageous public officials who just sat down and sweat through incredibly difficult meetings saying, we want everybody who's opposed to this to express their position, and we want to work this through until we come up with a resolution, and they did. Finally, the Dakota County story, where this really came out of environmental groups in the 1970s and 1880s, but environmental groups saying we want to protect the Mississippi River and the Minnesota River, and started working with L. Singer as the county staff there, and they're losing a lot of farmland to development. They wanted to kind of protect that in some way, but they also primarily wanted to protect open space so people could enjoy nature there. One of my favorite places to hike turns out to be in Dakota County. But they developed this map showing all these green spaces that are not only green spaces, but they're also networked together. They're a web of their own, where a fox that wants to start in the Minnesota River Valley can walk all the way through the county and undisturbed get to the Mississippi River on the east side of the county. So again, very long-term visionary thinking, and there was a conservative county commissioner who decided to be the banner carrier for this effort and saying, I'm going to put my political weight behind saving green space because it's the right thing to do for creating an environmentally strong community. He did that, and developers fought for the first couple of years until they realized people were buying houses because they were close to green space, and they were getting a little bit increased density, so they could make as much money doing this in a green way as they would if they had done it in more of a commercial way. And this is an example of how they've nested development with green space, a little bit higher density, but also some wonderful green areas for wildlife to roam through and for people to bike through and hike through and ski through. The other result of that is a group of Hmong farmers settled into Dakota County because there was a farm owner that said, you can use our land to farm. These are people who are immigrants. They knew farming very well and they wanted to keep farming. And when I first met them, they were not allowed at the St. Paul Farmers Market because they were Hmong. Now they're on the board of the farmers market. And they got an initial slice of land, and then neighbors saw that was a good thing, so their neighbors came out and said, you can use our land too. So that expanded over time as people, again, in collegial relationship with each other in neighborhoods, just started saying, I can do the right thing by letting Hmong people farm my land. And they just got $120 million from the state of Minnesota to buy this property so they could actually own this outright and develop a Hmong cultural center with, I think, some housing, but also, a permanent place to be farming. And they mobilized very effectively to get political support within the community. I'm going to wrap up here. Key themes I think the book develops, and you can tell me after you read it. The successful food webs that I've spoken with are successful because they connect with farmers, with consumers directly to build market power for farmers. So farmers are price setters and not price takers. And that's a very difficult shift to make. It's hard for farmers to get in that mentality sometimes, but without that market power, this stuff is just not going to be resilient over time. I think the other thing that's really critical, I mean, some of the hardest work to do, as I mentioned before, is it's how do we knit a system together that really works over time? It's not just a matter of one farm being good or one project being good or meeting our programmatic goals for our grant. It's really a matter of how do we build a food system? How do we build a web of relationships that will carry this forward when there's no funding or when conditions change and we get surprise? And I think that, to me, it's the hardest work we have. So even in, say, rural Minnesota with beautiful farmland and usually ample rainfall and a history of agriculture that's quite strong, it's the hardest thing to do to get rural communities to feed themselves and not simply be focused on exporting products out. So it's difficult work, but it's also the heart of what makes this work well. And the other thing I think is really true is that I have a lot of people since the pandemic have said, you've got to take these notions to scale, you've got to get big, you've got to do something that's really dramatic, will make things better quickly. And these efforts all question whether that's a good answer or not. They say, maybe that's good and maybe not. In some cases we want to go to scale because it's helpful. In some cases we don't want to go to scale because we need the small spaces to experiment, to be flexible, to be able to change to changing circumstances. So we take advantage of scale. We also take advantage of scope where we have a lot of small things that add to a bigger impact. And to me, that's a pretty important thing to add in. That's all I'm going to say for now. Yeah, I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but I'll be up here in front with books and you can collar me anytime. I'll be here for the whole conference.